Think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to all of you who are joining us virtually for this Grantmakers for Girls of Color live talk on how philanthropy can address anti-Black racism and bias with an intersectional lens. I want to thank you all for joining us and for watching us on Facebook Live. We had nearly 1,000 people registered for this discussion, so I hope that that is an indication of how enthusiastic people are about this topic. I want to offer a thank you to the Ms. Foundation for Women for being a co-sponsor of this discussion. I am Monique Morris, Executive Director of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, a funding community that works to amplify and resource the transformative organizing work that girls of color activists and advocates are leading to dismantle systems of oppression in the United States and to support philanthropic growth in support of girls of color. Joining me today is someone who really needs no introduction, but I'll offer one anyway. She is Kimberlé Crenshaw, a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia Law School, co-founder of the African American Policy Forum. She's a leading authority in the area of civil rights, Black feminist legal theory and race, racism, and the law. Her work has been foundational in two fields of study that have come to be known by terms that she coined: critical race theory and intersectionality. She's also one of my sisters in this work to combat the erasure of Black girls in discourses on racial justice and Black freedom. So thank you, Kim, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Very happy that we're doing this.
Yeah, me too. We're here today to talk about this issue of how philanthropy can address anti-Black racism and bias with an intersectional lens. So we're using one of your terms in even the title of this discussion. And I'm thrilled that we're able to do that, because I think many times people see this word and think about it as an intellectual exercise rather than a practice and a tool for us to engage in this work. I want to say to those who are joining us, there will be some opportunities for you who are participating in the live talk to engage in some polling. So before we get into really what intersectionality is, I want to start with sort of first some indication of who's joining us in the room. So there's a poll question, the first poll question that'll ask us who's in the room. But while people are telling us, who they are and, what's happening, I thought that I would start by just saying, this moment is calling us to be responsive and in partnership with Black communities, where people are sort of broadly describing this moment as a period of racial reckoning. I think that philanthropy is trying to respond and be in partnership in a way that is resourcing or attempting to resource those who are seeking justice from these historical traumas and deep-seated inequities. And in the midst of all of this, the Ms. Foundation for Women just recently released a study called Pocket Change, which found that giving to women and girls of color account for just 0.5% of the $66.9 billion that is allocated and given out by foundations, totaling just $5.48 per woman and girl of color in the United States. That's all women and girls of color, not Black specifically. So when we're thinking about the minuscule number that's going out to this broad category of women and girls of color, it really invites us into a deep inquiry as to what we're missing in this conversation, intentionally and unintentionally, and how we can fix it. The foundation study also found that organizations that serve Black and African American women and girls were more likely to have budgets under $50,000, which means we're also talking about a capacity issue, right? We're talking about how people are able to move in this work, how they are able to engage in this work. So I want to start us with, just thinking about, in the context of this, sort of broad discussion about racial justice, how it is that we are still able to move without a full interrogation of how intersectionality should be guiding our decision-making, our understanding of complex issues, and our responses in these moments of critical need. So Kim, talk to us a little bit about what intersectionality has been for you and why you introduced this term in the first place.
Well, thank you, Monique. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for inviting me into this conversation, a continuation of conversations that we've had over the last 10 years in thankfully growing audiences. When we first started talking about it, it was hard to get people to sit down to really focus on this. And that, frankly, is one of the products of intersectionality. So intersectionality, I guess the simplest way to put it is it marks the structures, the institutions, other axes of subordination and the ways they converge in the lives of those who are marked by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, by class, disability, gender expression. So intersectionality is not so much a thing that inheres in the body. It situates in institutions and how they apprehend these different bodies, how they see us, and importantly, how they don't see us. So I came up with intersectionality when I was trying to think about why the law didn't see Black women, why the law didn't understand the particular ways that Black women experienced race discrimination and the way that that might be different from the way men experience race discrimination. And similarly, the way that Black women experience gender discrimination and the fact that they often experience that quite differently from the way white women experience it. Now, for those of us who lived lives in these bodies, it's not a secret, right? Intersectionality wasn't telling us anything we didn't know. Intersectionality was trying to speak to the institutions that didn't seem to know what we know, that having an approach to race discrimination that does not look at its expressions through gender was not going to actively intervene in the kind of discrimination we were experiencing as Black women, and the same with respect to gender discrimination. So in a way, I consider it a remedial concept. We understand that we are all on the same aspirational page, but we're not all able to read what's on that page. So intersectionality is a prism. I'm going to help you see a little bit more clearly what's actually happening, because we believe that you really want to intervene and be effective. We believe that you don't intend for these interventions to actually reproduce the very exclusions that you're meaning to address, but there's a need for a prism to help see more clearly what's actually happening. So that's pretty much what intersectionality is. I'll add this additional piece. Intersectionality both shows us the structures that create inequality, but it also points our attention to the ways that our movements, our policies, philanthropy, when they do not pay attention to these unique intersections, they end up creating another intersectional consequence, which is silence, it's marginality, it's being placed downstream where trickle-down effects are supposed to reach us. So it's both the structures and it's our failed reaction to those structures that intersectionality tries to draw attention to.
You know, I think one of the most powerful things about this concept is it invites us to see ourselves where we may not be immediately visible, right? And to invite us into a space where we can begin to map where these gaps present opportunity for us to act. So it's not just an exercise of mapping for the sake of mapping, right? It's an exercise that brings us into a call to action, right? So again, I'm going to share this information that just came from the Ms. Foundation about investments, right? Where giving to women and girls of color account for 0.5% of the $66.9 billion that is granted by foundations, which is just $5.48 per woman and girl of color in the US. So we're going to issue a second poll that asks people about the extent to which they're having conversations about intersectionality in their current work, because we're trying to also understand how folks are thinking about their investment strategies and development of portfolios when they're seeking to engage in conversations about promoting equity and justice. But in the meantime, I want to take us back to now probably 12 years ago, maybe, when we were in Brooklyn and we were meeting with a group of girls for a focus group for one of the early studies that we were doing on this topic of school push out. And I remember we were sitting around the table trying to talk to the girls about their experiences with suspensions. It was a group of Black girls, their experience with suspensions and expulsions. And we were talking about violence in schools. And I remember how hard it was for us to get the girls to give us experiences about them, because immediately they started talking about the boys. We said, talk to us about your experiences with suspension. And immediately they started telling us stories about the boys. And I remember us walking away from that moment, or even sitting in that moment, honestly, saying out loud, like, you know, thank you for sharing that information about what's happening with our brothers. But, you know, baby, we're talking about you. Like, we're trying to understand what's going on with you. And part of what the consequence is for us not being able to engage in an intersectional way in some of these broad concepts about justice is that we promote the opportunity for folks not to see themselves in something that deeply impacts them, right? Like the girls had trouble locating themselves in a conversation about school discipline and the injustices that they were facing, largely because there was this dominant idea that they were somehow not impacted because, as you were just saying, right, erasure and you know, well, first of all, erasure is a form of violence, but you know, really, when we think about what we're trying to build in this moment, is the opportunity for us to see ourselves and then respond, you know, accordingly. So you've been doing these, you know, Under the Black Light series that helps us peel back, right? It helps us locate, you know, some of the things that are uniquely, or some of the communities that we're talking about are uniquely experiencing in this pandemic. And, you know, the pandemic at its intersections, right? Like the pandemic just didn't happen with all things being equal. The pandemic showed up in the lives of people who were dealing with complex structures of inequality already. You know, what were some of the sort of pre-existing analyses that you think, you know, facilitate this current understanding of, you know, conditions of vulnerability that philanthropy is, you know, grappling with, or that philanthropy should be grappling with?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Monique, when you remind me of that focus group that we were doing in Brooklyn, what really stands out to me was the fact that the young women could tell a story about the consequences, well, the reality of push out and the consequences of it. I know you remember this. One of the women had told us that her being pushed out of school started when she was suspended because a boy had been sexually harassing her. Yeah. And she was pushed out of school. Yeah. And we heard other stories from other young women who were seen as distracting. Their bodies were the embodiment of the problem, and they ended up being pushed out of school. So they could tell stories about push out, but because the framework was focused on boys, they were unable to match what actually happened to them to what had been defined as the social problem, where the racial inequality was. And it fits a broader frame problem that we have. So, you know, communications people say this all the time. If your facts don't fit the available frames, people can't hold the facts. They let them go. And we saw this happening with the girls themselves. They had the facts about their lives, but the frames didn't allow them to tell a story that we were used to hearing and lifting up as a story about a critical need that needed to be addressed. And so that's a sort of learned irrelevance that comes from us. It comes from philanthropy, it comes from policy analysts, it comes from our elected officials, it comes from our own families. So some part of what we were trying to do in opening up Under the Black Light is to bring forward a series of conversations that we've been having since that time. We had a series in which we went around the country and actually asked women and girls of color to come forward and tell the stories that people were not able to understand as a story of racial injustice, because they were stories about girls, women, trans women. They were stories that fell outside the traditional framework of what counts as racial injustice. So we knew that there was a need to break the silence around these issues. And we also knew that that work didn't become irrelevant once we moved into the COVID crisis. In fact, it is even more relevant in the COVID crises because, as was predicted, those groups that were suffering structural inequalities without any articulation around them were the first ones to show the impact of this particular crisis. Who are we talking about? We're talking about service providers. We're talking about home health care workers. We're talking about agricultural workers, and we're talking about the pipelines that lead to that. So many of our girls of color end up being in those pipelines because they're pushed out of school, because they don't have the same opportunities. And we are not talking about that when we're trying to create interventions to shift the pipelines. So Under the Black Light begins with the experiences, the intersectional vulnerabilities that COVID lays bare. Just last night, we did our 15th episode. We talked about you as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley was there, and she talked about how in significant ways, her entire sort of political agenda was framed around the idea that, first of all, Black girls are not being heard. They're not being attended to. In her city council meetings, when they were talking about the crises of school pushout, and she asked for data about Black girls, they didn't have any. If you frame a problem in a way that's exclusive, then that framing builds on itself. So for nearly 20 years, there's been a problem in the framing of school pushout that began with assuming that it was only a problem of boys. And then when philanthropy comes into it and simply follows the initial frame, they dig a deeper groove that makes it that much harder for us to be able to address what wasn't being addressed. And this is what you and I found out in Black Girls Matter in Boston. Black girls were 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. It was a greater disparity than even the disparity between Black boys and white boys. Why did no one know it? Because no one asked. Because everybody assumed that the existing parameters around framing the problem had been tried and true, tested and made real, rather than they're just the assumptions that make people think we can talk about racial justice without talking about gender, without talking about any of the other intersecting factors. So that was a mistake that we are now seeing some of the consequences of, trying to correct it by conversations like this. But let's not make those mistakes going forward in this moment that now there's a recognition that, hey, we haven't been paying attention to anti-Black racism as much as we should, so let's invest. Let's not invest in ways that continue that same exclusion. Let's make this an opportunity that we can make a difference in how we frame anti-Black racism.
That's right. I think what people miss a lot of times in this conversation is that when we're talking about racial justice, that you can't be an investor in solutions to racial justice if you're perpetuating harms in other ways, right? And there's a tendency that I've observed for us to silo our investments, silo our portfolios in a way that do either create some tension and competition among those who are doing this work, but that also, don't innately recognize the deeply intersectional work that's happening on the ground already. That was something that G4GC sought to try to address when we developed our Love is Healing COVID-19 Response Fund, which was to say, we're going to recognize that there are organizations that have been leading this work around racial justice for a very long time, organizations that have been trying to dismantle the structures of oppression in the lives of girls of color. And guess what? They're doing this work now in the context of this pandemic, and we need to show up somehow in this conversation to support them. Not to say, now you're in deep competition with each other, but to say we recognize that your works in efforts to reduce the harm of the pandemic are also part of dismantling the structures of oppression that are part of this racial justice movement and a part of this racial justice conversation. I think the invitation for philanthropy is to join us, right? Is to think about how we can support those organizations that have this critical analysis that gave us the language we're using even on the front lines when we see protesters moving and with signs that say her name, or we have, folks who are really, in deep movement work who have been involved in this conversation around not just constructing theories, but also priming our collective consciousness for this moment for the past 20 years and longer. You know, we can, and I think it's important for us when we think about this, especially in the context of the, you know, low giving that happens to those organizations that are led by Black women and girls, and the movement work that's led by Black girls, you know, to really, you know, have a conversation about why this idea that, you know, if we're addressing anti-Black racism, our primary response is typically to engage with organizations that might have more visibility or that might have a deeper capacity financially, rather than thinking about the strategy that supports those organizations that have, you know, 50,000 or less as their budget, or thinking about partnerships with organizations that can help us move resources directly to girls whose futures we say we're investing in. And this leads back to something that you have brought up in other spaces around this notion of trickle down, you know, justice. when it comes to Black girls, we sort of operate with this assumption that if we're investing in the larger organizations or the larger movement of racial justice, that somehow it will get to the groups that are holding this labor and have been holding this labor in very concrete ways for centuries. And that's not what we see, right?
No, no.
In fact, it's dangerous to think that, right?
It's dangerous, and I think I think we have to dial it back and see where the conversation about racial justice has been. Granted, this is a moment where all things should be on the table. So one thing that we should put on the table is the conditions that led to the trickle-down placement of Black girls. And when we think about it over the last, I'd say 20 years, the space for racial justice has basically been made up of what I call the sweet spot. Is the sweet spot between those who fear for the lives of their sons and those who fear those sons. So that's often been hailed as the bipartisan commitment to, you know, begin to address the consequences of over punitive responses to social problems, school push out, the growth of juvenile involvement in carceral systems. And folks have come together to say this is too costly. It's too costly with respect to the lives of boys who are caught up, and it's too costly with respect to society. It's costing us too much. Okay, so that's a possibility, but think about where girls show up when the main framework for racial justice funding is we want to intervene in fear-based policies. When you are living in a body that nobody really fears you, they just don't care about you. You don't show up. And you're not showing up means that basically no one's going to the table to say, what can we do to enhance the quality of their lives? And it also means that their lives aren't seen as being in need of intervention from within our community. So there's the conversations about the talks that need to be given to our sons, because we understand what the risks are that they face. But who gave the talk to Toyin Salau, the activist, 19-year-old who was putting her life on the line to fight for Black Lives Matter? Who gave her the talk that she needed to worry about not just the police, but she had to worry about men, specifically the man who took her life, who she was just hours before protesting for? Why aren't we telling the talks that we need to tell, you know, our children, our girl children? So, you know, trickle down effects, trickle down justice isn't going to work for the kind of risks that Black girls face. Trickle down justice isn't going to tell us why 40% of trafficked girls are Black. Trickle down isn't going to tell us, as Black Women's Blueprint does, that 60 or more % of Black girls have experienced a sexual assault. I mean, we could go on and on and on. The basic point is trickle down justice doesn't work when intersectional dynamics create different kind of risks. And we're now at a point where we have to say, we can no longer wait One of our campaigns is Why We Can't Wait. One of our campaigns is Black Girls Matter. It's an aspiration. The moment is to make good on that aspiration by putting the resources behind those who are closest to the problem, as you say, and as Congresswoman Presley says.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to where we are in this moment, right? Where we are having conversations within the philanthropic sector and other sectors with our partners about how we show up in this moment of deep community need. And one of the things that I think must be part of the practice of intersectionality, and one of the things that philanthropy can absolutely do differently in this moment, is to partner with those who are experiencing this work, right? Like I talk a lot about participatory processes, and I think many foundations are starting to move with participatory decision-making processes that allow for folks who are impacted by an issue to be part of the decision-making structure. But there also has to be this way in which we trust the leadership and invest in the leadership of those who probably occupy, you know, one of the least capacious places in our consciousness around giving, but have probably the most expansive, creative, you know, sort of innately valuable contributions to this conversation, and that's our girls. You know, we talk a lot about the magic they hold. I you know, moved around the country for a long time talking about Black girls being sacred and loved, because they are. But we've got to show that. $5 doesn't really show that, right? $5 says, here's my, you know, extra money, do what you're gonna do with it. And, you know, to the credit of the organizations that have been doing this work, you know, we do what we can do with it and look what we produce. But investing in the futures, for me, means that we have to bring ourselves to a new space. We have to bring ourselves to a conversation that when we demand for there to be an investment in this elevation and movement for Black lives, that we have to be absolutely intentional about making sure that we are targeting and working with, in partnership, the organizations who are on the ground leading this work, and our babies themselves who are, you know, living this moment in a way that we are not necessarily living this moment. You know, I think for me, that's where intersectionality becomes less of a theoretical exercise and framework and more of a practice around how we engage participatory models that allow for the voices of those most deeply impacted by a condition to help us develop an agenda that moves us to a space where we can't ignore the violence that our trans girls are experiencing, and the way that our Black girls are you know, participating in or trying to manage their own participation in this pandemic, right? We still see case after case after case that advocates are responding to, you know, with some degree of fervor, you know, around young folks who are, you know, criminalized for various activities that do not warrant it or that are at increased risk because the pandemic has created conditions that, you know, that are beyond all of our control. But we still need to be in a space where, as a funding community, we're willing to say, you know, how can we be in partnership with each other in a way that, as you say, recognizes what's really on the table right now, what the opportunities are in this moment. So with that, I feel like part of what, you know, our challenge is, even in this conversation, is to think about, you know, one, how we begin to deconstruct and continue to challenge that narrative that has been around for so long that it shapes our consciousness around where our money goes first and who we turn to for the expertise. And why it's important for us to continue to challenge ourselves, to think about, you know, who holds the truths that are going to inform a deep, transformative racial justice moment. I'm always brought back to a moment, you know, I had a fangirl moment with Angela Davis when I was starting this Push Out tour, and Angela, you know, Dr. Davis was talking about, you know, her body of work, and offered that, you know, this was always about Black freedom, right? That this movement that we have been in for a very long time is about Black freedom, and that we've settled for civil rights, right? We've settled for these conversations about, you know, equity, because we didn't necessarily achieve the justice that we were after. I think we're in a moment now where we can actually achieve justice. We can talk about freedom, and we can talk about it in a way that is about resourcing the brilliance in our communities. But we have to be committed to getting there, right? So how do we start this process? How do we use intersectionality as a way to get us to a space where we're able to talk about, dismantling those long-standing narratives about how we achieve justice in our communities?
Yes, yes. Well, I am hopeful, cautiously hopeful, Monique, that we are in a different place than we were 6 months ago. And whether that difference makes a difference really turns on what that energy is being mobilized to do in this moment. So what makes me hopeful is that so many people were able to see in that moment of Derek Chauvin taking George Floyd's life, not just a simple individual who has created an unimaginable injury to our society, but it is produced by decades of allowing the conditions for that taking of life to fester, largely uninterrupted. So I see in this moment a willingness to look at what are the conditions of possibility that led to that moment. What are the demands that hadn't been listened to? What are the ways that Blackness has been framed as a criminalizable condition, such that things that are done to our bodies are perfectly acceptable? So there seems to be an appetite for saying, okay, how have we contributed to this moment? How have we let, as you talked about, civil rights be a settlement for really embracing the notion of Black liberation and freedom? So my caution about the optimism is, will that willingness to self-interrogate transfer all the way down the trickle down a road? Will we be able to say, and not only does it not make sense for us to deeply invest in largely white institutions to handle the racial justice issue? We know that doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore. So let's figure out how we have starved Black institutions and Black leadership, those closest to the problem, from the resources to be able to actually develop interventions that can be scaled up. Let's make sure that that energy also goes the next step. So when we're talking about some of the ways that Black women are positioned with respect to all sorts of things, gender-based violence, state violence, economic violence, even knowledge-based violence, like taking us out of the framework. When we face those issues, are we as willing to see the need to elevate the leadership of those who are closest to that problem? Or are we doing the same thing when we finally notice, oh, Black women are killed by the police too? Where are we going to add our support? Well, we're going to add our support to well-funded male-led organizations. Or are we going to take that same lesson and say, the fact that Black women organizations are getting less than 1%, that's our stake in this problem. That's the thing that we can do something about. So it starts by actually self-interrogating the way people are, the way institutions are, but expanding that self-interrogation in an intersectional way. And then taking that information and moving on it. If you are looking at your portfolio and you have really been activated in this moment to actually give when it comes to Black Lives Matter, are you giving in a way that shows that all Black lives matter? Are you actually getting behind that aspiration behind Black Girls Matter? Or are you basically assuming that this is a trickle down approach? So if you see that you're doing trickle down funding, that's not intersectional. If you're not doing trickle down funding or don't want to, then apply intersectional lens to what you're doing and make sure that you are not reproducing the same exclusions that brought us to this moment.
Yeah. And I think there's also a space to have a conversation about how we hold space for gender fluid Black young people, even as we're talking about, the investments that are made for those that we call and who identify as girls of color and Black girls, right? So, but it's important in the funding domain to maintain some flexibility. I think part of holding an intersectional space in the funding, space is to think about how we engage in the possibility for there to be this, deep investment in our communities that face, historic and historical marginalizations without coupling, the conversation in a way that does a disservice to our capacity to understand and engage both communities or all communities that we're talking about. That when we're talking about intersectionality and when we're applying this concept to the development of portfolios, when we're applying this concept to the development of partnerships and new initiatives, that we're not saying we will not talk about young people without there being this deep interrogation of this one other issue, and that our funding that is specific to this one issue will, sort of somehow reach this other issue, even if they're not directly tied. And we saw that happen over time. When you and I were trying to bang down some doors and say, can we get funding to support the work that we want to do around Black girls, we were very clear that the young people that we were talking about in that space of Black girlhood involved girls, cis and transgender girls, young people who are non-binary, who or considered themselves gender expansive. But we also wanted to interrogate and work with them at the intersections of their identities, not only by a lens of their gender identity or sexuality. And so, I think part of the challenge for philanthropy in engaging an intersectional lens is to think deeply about how we're going to approach this work. I mean, I think here, shout out to Nikisha Lewis, who, years ago was like, let's do this work at the deepest point of intersections around sexuality and gender identity and, race. And, let's think about how we can try to move some resources to this space. And it's always been like one foundation or two groups that are willing to have that conversation.
One foundation is interested in one issue. And so if we could frame it that way, they were interested in another who was interested in other. But
right.
The idea of Black women and girls expansively as the thing that we were looking at, that was really, really hard for us to address.
Yeah. Right. So I think, for me, having lived that experience and then moving into this one, I think presents an opportunity for us to have some of these conversations about how we build out new structures, right? How do we build the new, ways of being so that it isn't, either a piecemealing of resources to maybe accumulate the $5 that we're seeing invested in our groups, but to really think about how we center our consciousness around this notion that we can't silo our investments because people don't live siloed lives. We can't allow for there to be an investment in a larger organization with the assumption that they're going to move with the same intentional space or intentionality around engaging in intersectional frame if we haven't done that work with them and that organization that they're sort of subcontracting with or supporting isn't in the conversation also, because sometimes we move with the expectation that the larger organization that has the capacity to handle the larger grant is going to be the one who leads the conversation, and oftentimes they're the organization that also doesn't have the deeply rigorous analysis, right? And so I think having some of those spaces where we pull people into community and really begin to think about where the leadership lies and how we engage young people into that space is one way to get us to move us forward in this conversation.
Absolutely.
So with that, I would like for us to move to some questions. I think we probably have a few questions, and I'll just invite a member of our G4GC community to share our first question.
Hi, yeah. We've gotten a lot of great questions in. Just start going through them. First one is, how do you answer the any resistance you get to centering Black girls and women, specifically, for example, if people say, what about Black men?
Okay, so sometimes it's really hard to know if that is a serious question or not, because if you look at where resources have gone or what the framing has been for the last decade, it is a framing around Black boys in particular. So this is obviously not an argument that Black boys are not significant and that they don't require resources. The point is Black girls do too. The point is that partly the problem of the misapplied frame is to see many issues that are actually issues having to do with race as issues having to do with the unique vulnerabilities of Black boys. Case in point, much of the argument around the push-out problem being an exclusively boy problem assumes that, first of all, the racial disparity is greater with respect to them, and it's not. It also assumes that some of the risk factors are quite different. And actually, when folks look at the data, many of the things that are quoted as reasons why the focus should be exclusively on boys actually applies to boys and girls. When it comes to the level of resourcing for the school, when it comes to the level of experience of the teachers, when it comes to resources for the community, Black boys and Black girls are actually far closer to one another than they are to other same gender cohorts. Namely, we're largely looking at a race problem that is differentially experienced by boys and girls, but the larger gap is between races as opposed to gender. So this is largely work that is asking us to pay attention to where girls are experiencing some of the same things, which they are, and to where girls are experiencing some different things, from sexual violence, from parental responsibilities, family responsibilities. There are different obstacles and barriers that girls face, and Black girls in particular have sets of stereotypes that tell us that the burdens placed on girls is justified because, after all, they're not really girls, they're little women. That's a specific burden that young Black girls face, and it's a specific burden that if we don't focus on girls, not to the exclusion of boys, but to actually militate against the exclusion of girls. So, I mean, that's what we say. The boys are there. We all need more resources. The girls are exceptionally in need of more resources because of the data that Dr. Morris has just shared with us.
And I think what's also important in that conversation is to recognize that if we see justice as more than just a pie to be divvied, then we understand that there is exponential opportunity for us to be free together. This is not, Audre Lorde gave us the space around recognizing that this is not and should never be an oppression Olympics.
Yes.
But this is about our demand to be seen in a conversation about freedom and justice, and to hold that space for our girls and women unapologetically because they're deserving of such advocacy. And I think we are deserving of such advocacy. And I think, when we have these conversations, we've had tons of conversations about this. I remember us, talking about how are we going to deal with people who say we're going to, be ignoring the boys, or why are we saying, and I think it is important to recognize that we are in the same family, right? There's a lot of bridge work that can happen, and that I think it will be happening soon. And I think it's time for that, right? We do share conditions that we should be exploring, and that does not mean that we can't engage in some specific responsive work and investments that allow for us to hold the complexity of these deep social problems, right? So I appreciate that. That's all I have to add. Do we have another question?
We have a lot of questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to group the two. These are two questions that have gotten the most upvotes. The first is, what are your recommendations for organizations working in these spaces who have a historically whiter donor base? How can we guide these organizations to this level of intersectionality that is so critical for our Black women and girls in our care? And I think different but related, are there any examples of foundations being true partners with organizations running by and serving Black women and gender expansive individuals? How do we, I think this is foundations coming to the table, for the first time, avoid deepening the grooves and blind spots?
I'm going to let you take
Start?
that one.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think for me, I will say, I think it is critical for us to continue to have conversations about these issues. I think part of how we have elevated our own consciousness about the need for there to be the, engagement of intersectional frames in philanthropy have come from, folks in the intellectual academy advocacy space being willing to go speak before boards and talk to the boards about what this work is and why we need to do it. It does take on an air of, people who are living an experience or studying an experience, educating those with financial resources to, help move some of their own consciousness around some of these issues. And I think that's really important work that G4GC is hoping to continue and build upon. I also think that it's important to maintain what G4GC has done in holding a space for learning and organizing among those within philanthropy who want to be more deeply engaged in how they hold some of those conversations and have resources to support that work. But I also think that it's really important for us to think about some of the emergent models of philanthropy that invite us into a deep conversation about reciprocity rather than the sort of saviorism that has guided so much of how we talk about investments in this work. And I think we all owe a deep set of gratitude to Edgar Villanueva, who has offered us the Decolonizing Wealth framework that I think if everyone in this discussion hasn't read this book, please go get it because it does give us a different framework, by which philanthropy can begin to explore its own capacity around how it is giving and what giving means in the context of some of these historical oppressions. And, the acquisition of wealth, the stewarding of wealth to move into resourcing movements and work specific to Black girls and young women, I think is really, has to be a part of our evolving conversations and discourses on, on how we're going to move in this space and where we're going to develop our portfolios and move work. I am, G4GC is just a few months old as its own independent entity. And so we're thinking about moving into structures that do provide a maximum opportunity for that kind of participatory work. I am aware of several foundations that have used different models of resourcing movement work that have boards and decision bodies that are 100% comprised of people who are in movement work themselves, guiding who is going to receive resources in their work. Some of them have rapid response strategies. Some of them have coordinated decision-making models where they can share who their grantees are and can work in partnership with other foundations to try to increase the amount that a single organization is receiving, so that we're not offering funds to an organization that aren't necessarily, I mean, all funding is helpful, but that isn't going to really move their work forward. So I think, these are ongoing conversations that just need to continue. That for me, this is an open inquiry about how we engage in this practice of building out philanthropic models that are rooted in love and reciprocity, and not necessarily just about charitable giving.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add some little scatter shot to that, because that I stand behind everything you just said, and I think that is the framing of it that I would sit with the most. And at the same time, I had a few things jumped in my head. I'm still reeling about the data that you shared. And I'm still thinking about, I said something last night on our Black Light that I'm going to stand behind. I do think that making such a small amount of resources available and pairing that with this idea that Black women and girls make a lot from a little, and making that sort of the norm. I said last night, I'm tired of the Black girl magic frame.
Right.
Because it means we have to be magicians in order to do what needs to be done. And there's sort of an acceptance of that idea. And I think we need to get out of the Black girl. We shouldn't have to be magicians to do the work that needs to be done. So, that's heavy on my heart when I think about it, because it matches up so much with the fact that, you know, the median net wealth that Black women have is less than $100. That $100 is the median net worth. So that just gives you a sense about how much disadvantage is shaped by race and gender. And so when we're at this moment and people are asking, what do we do? I guess I want to say what not to do. What not to do is the equivalent of what a lot of people have done. I read a couple of weeks ago that in this moment of people wanting to really get into Black life, one of the trending movies was called The Help.
I heard that too. That was so upsetting.
Okay. So,
because magic comes at a price. Okay.
Exactly. So, you know, I don't want to go in line of verse about what is so distressing about that.
Yeah.
But I want to suggest that there may be analogs to that. You know, are you stuck in the help moment, which is, oh, we've discovered Black women, and the way we're going to engage it is in a way that sort of maintains, or, you know, the relative disadvantage. But we'll give some attention to it, as opposed to not just looking at a story, but understanding the racial dynamics that are happening and the conditions that make that happen. So as you were saying, Monique, yes, it's important to have obviously more resources. It's important to have, you know, different ways of thinking about collaborations. It's important to have commitments to understanding what it is that consistently produces these outcomes. All of those things are important, and some of it means that there has to be internal interrogation. What is happening institutionally across the institutions? Why does the question have to predicate itself on the idea that there are so many philanthropic institutions that don't have Black women in them? Mm-hmm. And then, as my good friend Alvin Starks often says, are they able to come out as Black women, even if they're there? So there's just so much more, you know, to be asked now that there's some softness in the concrete. Now that we're able to remake things, let's remake the conditions of possibility as one of the aspects in trying to make more resources reflect the aspirations of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's partly where we get into this call to action, right? Like we're having this conversation now that is elevating some of the, you know, sort of critical issues that we grapple with when we're talking about how to increase capacity of the philanthropic sector to see Black women and girls in this conversation, to engage a lens in our own, you know, work that can actually reach all of us in this moment. And so, you know, when I think about a call to action, I think about where we're going to step in and begin to correct some of these, you know, these data points that I hope all collectively understand as deeply problematic. I think none of us should be satisfied with $5 being the average amount that's invested in girls of color and women of color in the US. That's just woefully insufficient. So I want to offer a third poll that is in essence a call to action around those on this call in terms of, you know, for those who are part of the philanthropic sector, how are you going to engage in this moment? So if we can share that poll, that would be helpful. But in the meantime, you know, Kim, what is your call to action for this, you know, conversation, and where do we move forward in this critical moment?
Yes. Well, so Monique, I completely am excited about this moment as we've been talking and the data that we have. So now we have a clear benchmark. We know what the disparity looks like. There's no way that we can move forward without being able to see the problem. And what I've said many, many times in the work that I do with my organization, the African American Policy Forum, if you can't see a problem, you can't solve a problem. And so much of what we have been doing is to make visible the problems that exist. And that, frankly, is the low-hanging fruit. In our Say Her Name campaign that draws attention to Black women being killed by the police, the low-hanging fruit is basically getting people to see that they exist, that Black women are also killed by the police, to just say their name. So enhancing the capacity of those of us who are running organizations that are trying to shed light on what is invisible, that's basically just 101, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not work that is easy to do. It's work that's costly. Actually trying to cast light into the shadows requires you to actually identify the shadows, show what's happening in them, and change the frame. But then beyond that, changing the capacity of all of us who are doing this work to actually doing it. And as I suggested earlier, putting that capacity in the hands of people who are doing it. Mm-hmm. At this point, many people are aware of Say Her Name, but at the moment when they say it's time to support, they're not supporting the organizations that have been putting it forward. So we recognize that there's an issue-based need to be attentive, and then there's leadership that needs to be attentive. I know I've been in this game for 22 years, and it's still a struggle for my organization. So I can imagine what it's like for younger sisters coming on board who are closer to the problems of young women and girls and don't have that support. So I would say that we're at a moment where it's important to support consortiums. It's important to support the consortium that Dr. Morris is heading up. For those who have an issue that they want to support, find the organizations who are doing that issue. Find the leadership. If you want to develop leadership for the future, find the ways to do that. It is just important to make this a ground-shifting moment, a transformational era in the struggle against anti-Black racism. And I'm just so delighted that we've got this moment, Monique, because I can remember 12 years ago when we had to have like a speakeasy to talk about these things. Right. Now we're talking to several hundred people. That's a big advance over what it used to be.
That really is. I appreciate that. And I think for those who are in philanthropy, it is important to streamline the processes as you're doing this work. One of the things that G4GC did when I came on was to develop the Love is Healing COVID-19 response fund. And we've been able to reach 85 organizations across the country, giving, more than $1.5 million out in the span of 3 months, because the project, was intentional, the process was streamlined, and we were, very much trying to practice this spirit and engagement around intersectionality. So I thank you all for joining. I'm so appreciative for your work, Kim, and your time in this conversation with me. And we'll just keep moving forward, because this is what we do.
It is. Thank you so much for having me, Monique. It's been an honor.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining.